The mansion sat on the edge of the hills, a towering silhouette of stone and silence, overlooking a valley that misted each morning like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. It wasn't just a house. It was a monument, an architectural echo of old wealth and old rules. Every line of its wrought iron balconies, every column at its entrance, was designed to tell the world, only certain people belong here. She arrived just after 7 a.m., as always. A quiet engine hum, a parking spot that wasn't quite on the driveway, and footsteps soft against polished concrete. She let herself in through the side door, not because she had to, but because she knew what the family expected. Expectations were everything in houses like this. It wasn't about how well you did your job, but how little space you took up doing it. Inside, the house was still. Marble floors chilled her feet through her shoes. The air was cool, climate-controlled, and perfumed with the distant scent of white roses, artificial but constant. She moved with practiced silence, walking past art that cost more than her last 2 apartments combined. She checked on the baby first. Always. The boy was still asleep, fingers curled, chest rising and falling in that perfect rhythm only children seem to possess. She smiled. Then she adjusted the blanket, checked the monitor, and walked back out into the hallway, just in time to hear the sharp clicks of heels approaching. The mother, Lydia, had returned from a yoga class she didn't enjoy, wearing a designer brand she didn't sweat in. She looked through the nanny, not at her, gave her instructions like commands with clipped kindness. There were always guests coming, always something delicate that needed dusting, always a reminder that she was just the nanny. Later that morning, as the father, Victor, stormed out of his office for a phone call in the courtyard, she moved through the house with the ease of someone who belonged, even if no one else believed it. She wasn't just memorizing the routine. She had designed it. Every step of the house, every child's schedule, every emergency plan. The systems she had put in place were now the invisible backbone of the family's daily performance. But they never noticed. That was the point. They noticed only when she lingered too long near the wine cellar, when she asked to adjust the housekeeper's hours, when she used the front entrance. That's when Victor barked, "You're just the nanny. Don't overstep." She had nodded then, not out of agreement, out of strategy, because the papers were already filed. The family trust, once frozen by years of litigation, had finally been resolved. And the last living heir had quietly named her as the sole beneficiary, not out of pity, but gratitude. Years earlier, she had saved a life, carried an old woman down a flight of stairs during a fire in a different house, a different time, before this family even knew who she was. And now, that old woman's estate included this house. Her name was on the deed. She just hadn't told anyone yet. Not because she was afraid, because she was waiting for the perfect moment to stop using the side door. She knew more about this house than the blueprints. She knew its rhythms, its secrets, its cracks. She knew the door that stuck in summer and the pipe that moaned in winter. She knew how to open the garden shed with a butter knife and which security camera had a 10-second delay. She didn't learn the house. She absorbed it. But still, they called her the nanny, with a smile, with a shrug. Sometimes with guiltless superiority, sometimes with flat dismissal. She wore the label like armor. The more they believed it, the less they looked at what she was doing. And what she was doing was preparing. She had already hired an estate lawyer. Not the flashy kind, but the kind who understood discretion and paperwork and loopholes. She had hired a financial planner to help her convert the trust into a holding entity. She had spoken to the property manager who oversaw the other 2 estates attached to the family name. All of it was silent, documented, sealed. The last step would be public. But not yet. She watched them fall further into their theater. Lydia planned a gala. Victor negotiated a merger he didn't understand. The house swirled with decorators, tailors, chefs, and through it all, she held the child, fed him, bathed him, and shielded him from the storm of polished indifference. No one noticed the property appraiser who came by on a Wednesday afternoon. No one asked why she took a call on the balcony with documents in her hand. No one saw the email she sent to the trust's executor that ended with the line, "Effective date confirmed." Notification to title office by end of next cycle. Still, they criticized her choice of shoes. Still, they scoffed when she corrected a mistake in the child's medical chart. Still, Victor grunted, "You're just the nanny," when she suggested replacing the cracked railing near the staircase. But she didn't argue. She nodded, then made a quiet note of the invoice she would approve once the title was transferred. She hadn't waited all these years to convince anyone of her worth. She had waited to own the entire conversation. And when that moment came, it wouldn't arrive with anger. It would arrive with a key. And a signature. The sun had barely risen when the envelope slid across the polished table in the law office. It bore no wax seal, no ribbon, no unnecessary flourish, just clean edges, a date in bold, and a signature. It was hers. Final confirmation. Effective immediately. The trust was dissolved, the assets transferred, and the deed filed. The mansion and the land it sat on now belonged to her, not in theory, not in negotiation, but in absolute, legal fact. She stared at the document for a moment in silence. Not with disbelief, but with a kind of reverent stillness, like watching a tide recede to reveal what had always been buried beneath. It was done, and yet nothing around her changed. The streets still buzzed with early commuters. The grocery store down the block still stocked overpriced wine. The Nanny app on her phone still buzzed with reminders to restock the baby's formula. The world had not yet caught up to her reality. But it would. Back at the mansion, the gala preparations were in full swing. Lydia barked orders at florists who barely concealed their contempt. A sommelier argued with the chef over wine pairings. Victor was holed up in his office, shouting over speakerphone at someone in a different time zone. Their lives revolved around illusions of wealth, of control, of exclusivity. None of them noticed the change in how she moved through the house. She no longer flinched at their tones. No longer stepped aside in hallways. When the housekeeper asked a question about scheduling, she answered clearly and copied the estate manager on the follow-up email. When the groundskeeper asked if the railing was finally being replaced, she nodded and said, "It's already ordered." They didn't notice, because they couldn't imagine her capable of owning anything beyond patience. Victor made an offhand remark at lunch. Something about help not understanding boundaries. She smiled. Later that day, a delivery arrived. An envelope for Victor, hand-delivered, requiring signature. Inside, a formal notification that the trust's remaining properties had been consolidated under a new legal owner. He read it twice, then a third time. And when he looked up, confusion turned to offense. He called his lawyer. His lawyer confirmed it. Every square foot of marble beneath his feet was no longer his. Not technically. Not financially. Not legally. It was hers. Still, he didn't believe it. He stormed through the house, paper in hand, demanding explanations, waving accusations. She was upstairs, reading to the baby. He stood in the doorway, breath short, rage bubbling, but when she looked at him, calm, unshaken, and said nothing, he realized it. He was yelling in a house that didn't belong to him, at a woman whose silence had more power than his voice. And for the first time in his life, the room no longer bent to his anger. She finished the story, laid the baby in the crib, and walked past him. He followed, demanding to know who she thought she was. She turned once, halfway down the stairs, and simply handed him a copy of the deed. His name was nowhere on it. Hers was printed clean, bold, and permanent. She didn't need to shout. She had outlasted them. She had outlived their assumptions. She didn't need the mansion to prove her worth. But now that it was hers, she would decide who was welcome in it and who wasn't. The morning after the gala was quieter than expected. Not because it had been a disaster. The wine had flowed. The music had soared. The guests had smiled, posed, mingled. But something had changed beneath the surface, something fundamental and unspoken. Because power, when it shifts, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums, steady and undeniable. The papers had begun to circulate. Not tabloids, documents. Legal ones. A real estate blog picked up on the title transfer. A Property Insider newsletter flagged the shift in trust ownership. At first, the names were redacted. But then someone, somewhere, leaked a full record, with her name on it, as owner of the mansion, and 3 other properties formerly tied to the Bloomfield estate. And just like that, she was no longer invisible. Calls started. Emails arrived. Developers and advisors and event planners who had ignored her now reached out with a different tone. Lydia noticed first. At brunch, one of her friends mentioned the ownership shuffle in passing, not realizing the implications. Lydia smiled, tight-lipped, and changed the subject. But something cracked behind her eyes. Victor took longer. He called it fake, then temporary. Then, after a call with his financial advisor, he stopped speaking altogether. The house moved on without them, because it no longer moved for them. She adjusted payroll with the estate manager, ensuring fair raises and back pay for underpaid workers. She met with staff privately, asked what they needed, listened without pretense. For the first time, the gardener was given full insurance. The cook was offered flexible hours to care for her mother. The mansion's ecosystem began to rebalance quietly and thoroughly. And still, she kept to the background. Not for shame. For strategy. Because while everyone scrambled to reinterpret the new order, she was already 10 steps ahead, meeting with contractors for sustainable upgrades, reaching out to an architecture firm to redesign the guest house into a daycare for staff families, reworking the mansion's tax structure to support local shelters. One evening, as the sky bruised into twilight, she walked the property alone. The fountain gurgled in the silence. Light spilled from chandeliers. The air smelled of something new, not lilacs and indifference, but soil, paint, pine. Renewal. And in that moment, she realized something vital. She hadn't taken the mansion from them. They had simply never deserved it. She had protected it, lived in it, known every inch of its heart. She had carried the home, its people, its rhythm, its future, on her back for years. They had only posed in front of it. Now, every marble stair they walked upon was hers. And soon, they would no longer walk there at all. By the end of the week, the mansion no longer operated under their rules. Victor still stalked through the halls, clinging to phone calls and illusions, demanding explanations from lawyers who now answered him with silence or invoices. Lydia tried to regain her social standing by throwing brunches, only to discover half her guests were no longer returning her calls. The staff, once stiff with fear, now moved differently. Lighter. Steadier. They looked her in the eye. They spoke to her like someone who mattered. Because she did. The transformation was quiet but total. The family's name was scrubbed from the entrance plaque. The guest house lease, once reserved for Lydia's sister's occasional visits, was terminated and converted into a non-profit office for a neighborhood literacy program. The parking lot, previously gated with coded arrogance, was reopened with a rotating pass system, allowing not just access, but welcome. And all of it was hers to authorize. She hadn't inherited this home. She had earned it through years of unnoticed labor, restraint, and unwavering care. She had carried the emotional weight of a household that never saw her as more than a tool. And now she was redistributing that weight, brick by brick, into something sustainable. Then came the moment no one thought would come. She asked them to leave. Not with bitterness. Not with cruelty. Just a letter. A formal notice, printed in clean serif font, signed in her name. They had 60 days to vacate. It stunned them. Victor tried to fight it. He called it betrayal. But there was no clause to contest, no loophole to hide behind. The mansion, legally and practically, no longer belonged to him. Lydia wept, not out of sadness, but rage. The rage of irrelevance. She had treated the nanny like a shadow for years, and now that shadow was her landlord. Their son, too young to understand, only reached for her as she passed through the foyer on her way to the garden. She knelt down, kissed the top of his head, and whispered something too soft for anyone else to hear. Then she stood and walked outside. Because she knew something they never had to learn. Owning a house means nothing. What matters is the soul you build inside it. And she had done that every day. They'd called her just the nanny. Now she was building something new. And they were no longer part of it. 60 days passed like the last breath of a season, quiet, slow, and irreversible. The family packed their things in silence. No staff helped them. The house no longer bent to their habits. Their power was gone, and they knew it. Lydia no longer spoke to anyone outside her own bedroom. Victor wandered the halls with a look of disorientation, as if the walls had rearranged themselves overnight. Their illusion had shattered, and what remained was just furniture, dust, and the memory of ownership. On the final day, she stood at the top of the stairs as the movers carried the last of their things past her. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence was the punctuation mark at the end of their sentence. When they left, she didn't close the door behind them. She left it open. Let the air flow through. Let the house breathe again. Then, for the first time, she walked the entire property, not as a caretaker, not as an observer, but as a sovereign. Every step felt familiar, but changed. The echoes of her past still lingered, the whispers, the orders, the slammed doors, the words just the nanny, hurled like arrows. But they no longer pierced. Now, they only proved the distance she had traveled. The renovations began soon after. Walls once built to separate were opened. A wing of the estate was transformed into a community art studio. The upstairs salon became a reading room for children from local schools. The ballroom, unused for anything other than staged dinners and empty applause, was turned into a free prenatal care center staffed by traveling nurses. And through it all, she remained steady. No interviews. No press. No gloating. She didn't need to be famous. She needed to be effective. On the anniversary of the ownership transfer, the estate team surprised her with a small plaque on the front gate. Simple, elegant, cast in bronze. For the one who made this house a home. Even before it was hers. She stood before it for a long time. Not out of pride, but because it reminded her of what they had tried to erase: her presence, her labor, her brilliance, her soul. Now it was engraved. And every child who walked through that gate would know this house wasn't always kind, but it had become something more because someone once dared to belong where she was told she didn't. She walked back inside. Not through the side door. Not with her head down. But through the front entrance where she had always deserved to be. Because she wasn't just the nanny. She was the owner. And everything they'd built on her silence now stood on her name.